Just days after Russia hit Kiev with its powerful nuclear-capable hypersonic Oreshnik ballistic missile, it has carried out a major strike on the northern Ukrainian city of Chernihiv. Around 15 explosions were reported across the city, located near the border with Belarus and Russia, as the Russia-Ukraine war only escalates at an alarming pace, possibly even spreading to Belarus. Residential and infrastructure damage has been reported across the city in the north of Ukraine, while casualty figures have not been confirmed yet. Now, after using the Oreshnik, Moscow threatened a fresh wave of systematic strikes on Kiev, targeting decision-making centers, their command posts, and their drone manufacturing facilities. Issuing a direct threat to Russia's ally Belarus, Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces commander Robert Madyar Brovdy stated that Ukraine has listed 500 potential strike targets inside Belarusian territory. He states that the list of targets will be struck immediately by Ukrainian drones if Belarus decides to enter the war directly. It's a direct threat going out from Ukraine to Belarus. In the midst of this, Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, announced the opening of a criminal investigation into a May 22nd strike on a student dormitory in Starobilsk in Russian-occupied eastern Ukraine. He claimed 3 successive waves of Ukrainian drones leveled a 5-story college dormitory, reportedly killing 21 students while they were sleeping.
The deliberate nature of the attack is further confirmed by the fact that 16 UAVs targeted the same location in 3 successive waves, causing the 5-story dormitory building to collapse down to the 2nd floor. It's yet another glaring manifestation of the Nazi and terrorist character of the Kiev regime, which does not hesitate to kill minors in cold blood. Russian investigative authorities have opened a criminal case on charges of terrorism.
On Vladimir Putin's command, Russia warned the US to evacuate its embassy in Kiev, asking US diplomats to leave Kiev immediately ahead of Russia's strikes. Similar warnings were also issued to other foreign missions in the region. In the latest, Russia has passed a law asking its top financial institutions, including Russia's biggest bank, to buy and deploy their own drones for their safety, bear the cost themselves, and shoot down Ukrainian drones. Now, as the intensity of strikes on Ukraine increases, as the intensity of the war increases, threat of the war spreading to Belarus also increases. Warnings have been issued to foreign missions, and even financial institutions in Russia are not safe from Ukrainian attacks. Is this the biggest escalation in the Russia-Ukraine war, which is already in its 5th year? For more on this, I'm now being joined live by Dr. Gilbert Doctorow, international affairs analyst, author and historian, joining from St. Petersburg, Russia. And I'm also being joined by Scott Lucas, who's a professor of international politics at Clinton Institute, University College, Dublin. Thank you to both my guests for joining me here. I want to start right off. Professor Lucas, let me take your opinion first. Is this the biggest escalation of the war? Where do you see this one heading?
No, it's not the biggest escalation of the war. Let's take this in 2 respects. First of all, the Ukraine call, which says, look, if Belarus attacks us, then we will respond. That's in the context since February 2022 and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion, where Moscow has wanted Belarus to enter that war. But the Belarusian leader, Alexander Lukashenko, has held out against that. He's held out against sending troops then. He's held out against Belgium's forces joining the Russian missiles and drones that have bombarded Ukraine on a daily basis. But Russia and Belarus staged nuclear drills last week. Moscow is also playing up other signs that it would like Belarus to enter the war. So Ukraine is saying, look, no, this is off limits. The second argument here, and you talked about it previously in your report, is the fact that Russia has escalated its drone and missile strikes on Ukraine in the past couple of weeks. In a 48-hour period alone, last week, it fired more than 1,600 drones and 90 missiles on civilian areas. On Sunday, it fired more than 600 drones and scores of missiles, most of them at Kyiv, and threatened not just Ukrainian civilians, but threatened foreign diplomats, as you mentioned, to leave the capital. The Russians are using the pretext, and I have to emphasize the pretext of the Starobilsk drone attack, where we have conflicting accounts of what happened. The Russians say that 21 people were killed there in a college dormitory. Ukraine said it was aiming at a drone command center, Rubicon Center nearby. It could well be that one of those drones went off course and hit this and caused that. Whatever the circumstances of this, and we need an independent investigation, not a Russian investigation of that. Moscow's clearly using this as a pretext to try to expand its attacks on the civilian areas in Ukraine, because that's really their only option right now. Economically, they're facing issues. They're not advancing on the front lines.
I hear you.
And politically, of course, they're holding out against a ceasefire.
All right, let me go over to Dr. Doctorow now. Dr. Doctorow, and I've read it in your posts as well, you don't see this as an invasion from Russia that took place in 2022. You assess the war in a different manner. You bring in the Russian perspective. Let me come over to you. Do you see this as the biggest escalation? And do you agree with what we've heard from Professor Lucas?
Well, it hasn't reached yet the point where I'd call it a massive escalation. The changing nature of the war will be when Russia hits and destroys the centers of decision-making in Kiev, meaning destroying the political aristocracy of the Zelensky regime. If they kill, if they destroy the legislature, if they destroy the central government offices and possibly kill Zelensky, then that will be a massive escalation of the war for the purposes of a de-escalation. Why a de-escalation? Because the war will end. What has been surprising to me as an observer with no vested interest in cheering on Putin or cheering on Zelensky has been the unwillingness of the Russian president to use the weaponry at his disposal, to use the legal powers at his disposal to finish off this war. He has allowed it to continue and fester because in the first 3.5 years of the war, time was playing on Russia's side in a war of attrition. That was an artillery war by essence, where Russia from the first days had a 10-to-1 advantage in artillery tubes and in the explosives to send to Ukraine. That advantage disappeared about 6 to 9 months ago when it became a drone war. And in a drone war, it's a great equalizer. It was like speaking about you introducing pistols instead of swords. It was an equalizer. The Ukrainians were quite skillful in manufacturing and in procuring from England and Western Europe highly advanced drones that can penetrate, as we now know, 500 kilometers, 1,000 kilometers. They can go really deep into Russia. The difference, of course, between a drone and a ballistic missile is the weight of what they carry, and therefore the explosive potential and the damage that they can do. Drones are not ballistic missiles, and Ukraine has been at a disadvantage there. Nonetheless, the Ukrainians are gaining ground thanks to massive assistance from the UK, from from Germany, from France, in preparing themselves to manufacture large numbers, medium-range missiles that could do great damage to Russia. So time is no longer on Russia's side.
I hear you.
And the popular mood in Russia is to end the war at once. So Mr. Putin has been under immense pressure to do what we're now witnessing.
All right, let me go over to Professor Lucas. You've heard Dr. Doctorow's assessment. He's even positioning Russia in a position of strength at this point, that they're not applying all the arsenal, the military arsenal that they have at their disposal. We've seen repeated uses of the Oreshnik missile. They had attempted it once in 2024. Those missiles look like meteors falling from the sky. That kind of weaponry has been used once again. It's sending a clear signal, warnings or threats, whichever way one would like to see it. It's been issued to diplomats from other nations. And as Dr. Doctor also pointed out, other nations from Europe are anyways helping out Ukraine. Now, Professor Lucas, do you find any possibility in the midst of this kind of a scenario for those trilateral talks that Donald Trump had positioned himself to be a part of to be taking place? Is there any position or any lead moving towards diplomacy?
Thank you. Yeah, I find it interesting, first of all, that Gilbert has acknowledged what the Kremlin will not, which is that it's on the defensive against Ukraine, including those counterattacks inside Russia. But to follow his reasoning to get to an answer to your question, what he effectively said is that Russia could and should commit war crimes with targeted assassinations, not only of civilians, but of officials, similar to what the United States and Israel did in Iran recently. What he's actually said is, and Putin is not held back from using weaponry. Russia has fired, tens of thousands of drones, thousands of missiles for 51 months on Ukraine on a daily and nightly basis. So the idea that Putin is held back from mass killing is ridiculous. What the implication here is that Putin has some weapons, and you've referred to the Orezhnik missile, which is nuclear capable, in other words, which he could resort to, in other words, nuclear weaponry. Let's hope that we don't go down that path. The fundamental here is that the talks are stalled. The talks are stalled for two reasons. One is that the U.S., which was the broker, the Trump administration is now occupied with its failing war on Iran, tied up there. It effectively has walked away from the talks. And secondly, it comes back to the Kremlin. The Kremlin don't want a ceasefire. The Kremlin want to seize the rest of the Donetsk region, this strategic region in eastern Ukraine. They want Ukraine not to have security guarantees to keep the rest of the country weak. Don't take that from me. That came from officials close to the Kremlin in a long report by the Financial Times this week. Until the Kremlin accepts a ceasefire on the front lines, no, these talks are not going to go anywhere. And it becomes a question of how much pressure can Ukraine, which has defended itself against Russia for 51 months, how much with the support of partners, especially European partners, can it put on Russia to actually finally get to the negotiating table and be willing to halt the invasion?
Dr. Doctorow, some of the reasonings that you put forward, Professor Lucas did not see them as reasonable. But let me just bring in a few more aspects here, which brings me back to my larger question. Is this the biggest escalation? Both gentlemen do not agree with it. But in 2024, before the Biden administration relieved the White House, the last move was to give direct access and the green light to Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles, which would aid them to target deep inside Russia. That was a big escalation. Nuclear drills were taking place from Russia. That was the worst that we could have seen of the war back then. Now, what we're seeing is a direct warning being issued to U.S. diplomats, the U.S. Secretary of State directly. Get your diplomats out, leave Kiev. We're not going to be sparing much of their control centers, their drone assessments, or their other facilities. And we're also seeing the Orezhnik missile becoming more regular in use. Do you still agree that this is not the biggest escalation? And also you've heard Professor Lucas' assessment. Give me your take.
You can fire 600 drones, 1,000 drones a day into Ukraine. But if they're headed in the wrong targets, then that has nil effect. The Russians have not gone
Dr. Doctorow, wait.
Of the Ukrainian regime.
Dr. Doctorow, if you can just repeat that. We lost your connection for a bit. If you can just repeat your initial lines, please. We lost your connection for a bit.
Most tremendous pressure.
All right, I think we'll try to reconnect with Dr. Doctorow there. Professor Lucas, I'll come back to you. There's been another threat that has been issued directly now from Ukraine to Belarus. At this point, 500 targets, that's a list that Belarus already has ready with them. Dr. Doctorow, can you hear me clearly? If we have your connection ready, I would like to take your assessment. All right, so we will try to connect with Dr. Doctorow. I'll ask my control room to just connect with Dr. Doctorow again. Let's get that connection stable and we can continue the conversation. I'll come back to you, Professor Lucas. The warning that has been issued to Belarus, is there scope for Belarus to be getting involved?
I don't think Belarus wants to be involved. Moscow made the request to Belarus in 2022, in the opening days of the invasion, to put their forces in. And as I say, Alexander Lukashenko, while his country is effectively subservient to Russia in some ways, economically and politically, he does have a level of autonomy, and he didn't just want to be Putin's puppet. And so for that reason, he held out against engaging in that. Belarus has gone as far as to say to the Russians, look, you can stage your forces on Belarusian territory. We'll even let you stage your nuclear forces on Belarusian territory, but our forces are not going to get involved. If Belarus steps that up, and starts to assist the Russian attacks, then we're in a different phase. I think the real risk here is, and I do think that you are talking about the risk of escalation. The risk of escalation has actually come from Gilbert in terms of what he's just said. Using the idea that Ukraine is a regime, not a government, and it is a government, he again tried to justify targeted assassinations, killing the president, Zelensky, killing other officials. If Russia tries to do that, they're not only committing war crimes, they're actually going all out. Because what would stop Ukraine and its supporters from then saying, well, we could carry out attacks on the Kremlin? The fundamental here is, and I think we can all agree on this, Russia started this invasion in February 2022, the full-scale invasion. It needs to stop. There needs to be a ceasefire, because even if we're not at a point where this escalates in the next few days, few weeks, this is still deadly on a day-to-day basis, and no one is winning this conflict. Russia certainly is not. And Ukraine, while resisting Russia, it deserves that ceasefire so that its civilians can have a measure of security.
Professor Lucas, there were targeted attacks from Ukrainian drones, even going as far as the Kremlin as well. And that is where Russia comes from, where they say that there are targeted assassination attempts being made from the Ukrainian side. We're almost run out of time, but we have Dr. Doctorow with us. Let me quickly get his assessment before we move further. Dr. Doctorow, if you can hear me. Professor Lucas does not agree with your assessment of calling Ukraine a regime, the government in Ukraine. And that is the reasoning why this war is also continuing, if I were to just put it concisely, of what Professor Lucas meant. Dr. Doctorow, how do you assess it?
The term in office of President Zelensky and of most of the Rada expired a year ago. So what do you call a government that no longer is working within the constitutional framework? Secondly, the notion that the Russians would be the first to initiate assassination is nonsense. What do you call the attack on the Valdai residence of President Putin, if not an assassination attempt that was guided by Ukraine with assistance from MI6? The assassination attempts have taken place, and the Russians are not the first to try it. Ukraine is the first to try it.
That's ridiculous.
All right, Dr. Doctorow, I've heard your assessment. I believe we would like to have more time so that we bring in your perspective as well, so that it's equal for both our guests. Perhaps next time we do this conversation, we'll have a stable connectivity so that we can bring in both perspectives for the betterment of our viewers as they listen in to this debate. To both my guests, thank you so much for bringing in your perspectives. This war is only seeming to be escalating. There will be more to discuss. I look forward to discussing with both gentlemen again.